Hello, welcome to Spotlight. Tonight, the infected blood scandal, the treatment disaster that changed people's lives forever. In an investigation special, we hear the devastating stories of some of the families affected.
He would have been 42 now, and he should still be here. If he hadn't been given the infected factor 8, he would still be with us today.
I'll be joined by some of those living with the consequences, with a month to go until the public inquiry report is released. Plus, of course, the rest of the day's news. It's been described as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Between the 1970s and the early 90s, an estimated 30,000 people were infected with HIV and hepatitis C from contaminated blood. Some were infected as part of their treatment for haemophilia, a rare genetic condition. Others were given blood transfusions after an operation or an accident. After decades of campaigning, in a month's time, a public inquiry will reach its verdict. But will it bring closure for victims? Rebecca Ricks from our investigations team has been speaking to a family torn apart by the death of their son.
Good morning, son. Merry Christmas to you. All right?
Get my stomachache.
Fella?
Stomachache.
You got a stomachache?
Lee Turton was 10 when he died.
I couldn't get to sleep. Son was there.
He had haemophilia but contracted HIV when he was given contaminated blood.
He would have been 42 now, and he should still be here. If he hadn't been given the infected factor 8, he would still be with us today.
At the time, factor 8 was a revolutionary new treatment. They say they were told it was safe. Lee was 4 when he was diagnosed with HIV. They wanted the hospital to keep it private, but say it was leaked to the school.
The parents had been told, and they didn't want him in the school. There was 2 teachers that didn't want to teach him, and they were in the school. But the headmistress was lovely, and she said, he stays. He was sort of like a little leper, really, which is hard. And how do you explain to your child, all his friends are going to party and he's not been invited?
Denise and Colin moved to Cornwall, where they felt forced to keep his illness a secret.
We couldn't tell him because we had 2 daughters, and we were worried about what was going to happen to them. His sister, who was 2 years younger, was getting bullied at school and beat up, and we didn't know.
By the sea, he had a chance at childhood, until his health worsened.
He's a little boy, and he's being put through all this because somebody gave him 2 viruses. We were given 10 days, and he wanted to go to the beach. We wrapped him up and took him down to see the sea. And then he died on the 8th day. We've been lied to for over 40 years. Justice, I don't think we'll ever get real justice because nobody will be held to account over it. I think they've all got away with everything.
Lee was one of around 380 children infected with HIV after being given the contaminated blood product factor 8.
As well as children and adults with bleeding disorders, other patients were impacted too. People needing blood transfusions, some living for decades never knowing they'd been infected, like Stephen Smith. Here's Amy Gladwell.
So I can show you what happened. It's the 4th of December 1985.
The day Stephen Smith had an accident and a blood transfusion.
And my foot went straight through the glass, and I severed everything on my lower leg. And it was about 2, 3 in the morning, nurses all coming round, and I've looked to the right-hand side and I can see this pole with a bag of blood on it.
It was contaminated with hepatitis C.
Apparently so.
He was 22 when he was infected and says it was life-changing.
You get mental symptoms, but you get physical symptoms as well. And it doubles you up in pain. It's an awful, awful pain. On the mental side of things, you get brain fog, always tired, lethargic all the time.
He would say to me, "What's wrong with me?" He said, "Is this the behaviour of a normal person?" And I used to say to him, no, it's not.
But Stephen, who lives in Cornwall with his new wife Marina, didn't know he'd been infected.
So straight away, first thing I've gone, have I killed my wife? Is it because of me that she's dead? Because she died of liver cancer.
His previous wife, Yvonne, died 12 years ago.
And that absolutely destroyed me.
Left untreated, hepatitis C can cause life-threatening liver damage, although it's very rare to pass it on through sex. Stephen is now remarried to Marina and cured, but says the emotional scars remain.
Amy Gladwell reporting there. Well, two very different stories, and there are thousands more like them. Joining me on the sofa are three guests who have all been deeply impacted by this. Sue Threakall, Richard Waring and Challis. Thank you very much for coming into the studio. Sue, let's begin with you. Tell me what happened. You lost your husband in 1991. What happened?
Yes, we were married in 1981. We almost made our 10-year anniversary. Shortly before we got married, they changed his treatment to factor 8, and he very quickly developed hepatitis B. He'd also contracted hepatitis C, but was never, ever told that. And then in 1985, they told him that he got HIV.
And that must have been absolutely devastating, a diagnosis like that.
Yeah, it just... Well, it was just such an awful shock. I mean, we were trying for a second baby at the time, and the only advice we were given was use a condom and tell Sue not to get pregnant for a few years until we know more about it.
That's totally shocking. And I know you said earlier that you weren't immediately told about his HIV diagnosis,
No.
which would have put you at risk too.
I was at risk for about 6 months, yes, of contracting it. And I was fortunate that I didn't contract it, but many women did, through no fault of anyone.
And what was the support like then? And what was the impact on your family?
Well, there was very little support because it was a new thing, certainly in our country, although there was a 2 to 3 year time lag between what was happening to us and what had happened in the States. So they had 2 to 3 years in which to come to grips with it. But decided instead to sit back and monitor what happened to the haemophiliacs in our country.
And Richard, you're a haemophiliac. You were getting that high-risk treatment, factor 8. At the time, did you know what you were getting? Were you concerned that there could be viruses in it?
Well, up until 1982-83, no. It was sold to me as a wonder treatment, which it was in my early years, because it allowed me to get my education, go to university, have home treatment, which I'd never been able to do before. So in those early years, I had no knowledge of the dangers, and it wasn't until we came to 1983 or so when the scare came up. And I became very worried. I was traumatised by it, and then I was starting to get the rumours and people, who were speaking behind my back, and it was not very nice. So I plucked up the courage.
People talking about you because you were having this treatment, and they thought that maybe you'd be next.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm convinced I lost a girlfriend at the time for that reason, and lots of things really. I mean, I had a few good friends, and you learn to, you learn who your real friends are.
But it must have been quite terrifying having this treatment if you knew that potentially it could be contaminated. HIV was known about in 1985, and you were having the treatment then.
Yeah. Yes, I was. And especially when I was given, on occasions, Armour product or Cutter product. And I didn't know. Whether that was going to be the time when I would get HIV. Miraculously, I had a test done in 1985, plucked up the courage to have that done, and I was cleared. There was no HIV, so I was in the clear for that time, and that gave me a relief. But we didn't know, of course, about hepatitis C at that stage.
And when you had your diagnosis for hepatitis C, what were your thoughts?
Well, the way in which I was told, but it was actually my wife was told, was when she was 8 months pregnant with my daughter, and she went into the GP's surgery to try and get my result because it hadn't come out. Hers was negative, and she asked the receptionist, who went on the computer and had a look, and she said, "Oh, it's positive," in front of everybody in the waiting room, and my wife nearly collapsed and had to be taken into a side room to calm her down. And she was left to tell me when I came home from work.
And back then there was no cure for hepatitis C, is that right?
Yes, right, yeah.
So you thought that that was a diagnosis that could end your life?
Yeah, it was a death sentence at that time. It was devastating.
And Kaz, you contracted hepatitis C in a different way. You had a blood transfusion, but when you went into hospital, you were pregnant, you were having treatment for cancer at the same time, which is so much to bear as it is, but that treatment didn't make you better. You got hepatitis C.
In trying to cure me from, well, in curing me from one life-threatening illness, I was given another. I had 3 blood transfusions, one pre-diagnosis of cancer for the general anaesthetic, and then a further 2 due to anaemia from the 2 6-month rounds of chemo I had. And then I was being screened for a stem cell transplant, and that's when they found the hep C and told me. So I was infected 6 months after they started screening blood, but they still had blood in the system stored.
And what has been the impact on your lives? Because you haven't been able to live your lives as you would have done. It's impacted you financially, hasn't it?
It has, almost from day one, really, because once Bob was diagnosed, we became aware that at some point I would be looking ahead to being a single parent instead of having the bigger family that we'd always planned. I had to give up work as a deputy head teacher to look after him for the last few months because he was so very poorly, and was never able to get back into that level of work.
And Kaz, what was the impact on you? Because I know you told me that you weren't able to care for your children in the way that you wanted to.
I was on benefits. I set up a cancer support group and ran that for 10 years and did a counselling diploma and would have had a good career as a counsellor. I really loved doing it. But I was forced in the early 2000s, forced to stop doing that work because I just didn't have the stamina because the hep C was cranking up by then. So it took my career, it stole my career, and that meant that we were living on the breadline and I couldn't be the mum that I wanted to be for my children. It had a massive impact.
Well, let's pause there for a moment for an update with our health correspondent, Jen Smith. Jen, we've been hearing some really shocking stories tonight. Why was this so widespread, affecting so many people?
Well, it was a combination of factors, really, Gemma, but ultimately factor 8 replaced a treatment called chiroprecipitate. It meant people with blood disorders could be treated at home. It was made by pooling blood from tens of thousands of donors. So if one was carrying a virus, the entire batch could be contaminated. Because in the 70s, the UK was struggling to meet demand for blood clotting treatments, so it imported supplies from the US. But it was high risk. Much of it came from prison inmates and drug users. Separately, a second group of patients were given a contaminated blood transfusion after childbirth, surgery or other medical treatment between 1970 and 1991. There were also issues with the domestic supply of blood. UK blood donations were not routinely screened for hepatitis C until 1991, 18 months after the virus was first identified. So, what changed? Well, by the mid-1970s, there were repeated warnings that imported factor 8 carried a greater risk of infection. But attempts to make the UK more self-sufficient in blood products in the following years failed, so the NHS continued to use foreign supplies. By April 1985, all factor 8 products were heat-treated to kill the HIV virus, but it was too late. But what happens now? Well, experts say that the contaminated blood scandal could never happen again in the UK. Treatments and regulation have completely changed. In the 70s and 80s, responsibility for processing blood was down to individual NHS regions rather than a national service, as these pictures show. But today in the UK, it's run by NHS Blood and Transplant, which is based in Filton near Bristol, where hundreds of donated bags of blood arrive each day. And Andrew Barker is the Regional Operations Manager at Filton.
So we typically receive between 2,000 and 2,500 units of blood into Filton every day. Once they're registered, the first process is to remove the white cells. And we do that by hanging the blood up on this device. The blood drains through the line here into this filter that removes the white cells and the platelets and collects in this bag here. From here, all the whole blood is taken into the pod where it is processed down into constituent parts. At the same time as we're processing, testing samples for various pathogens.
Well, Dee Threakall is the Chief Nursing Officer, NHS Blood and Transplants.
So the UK blood services have transformed since the 70s and 80s. We have improved innovation, systems and processes, and the events that happened in the 70s and 80s would not be able to occur again.
So to be clear, it's still possible that blood could become contaminated, but the chances are now minute. The last known case, Gemma, was more than a decade ago.
Jen, thank you. Well, let's return to our guests now. There's a month to go until the public inquiry publishes its findings. An interim report has already stated that wrongs were done at individual, collective and systemic levels. Sue, what would you like to see come out of the inquiry?
I'd like to see two things. First of all, I'd like some sort of vindication in that the general public will finally realise that our narrative over the last 4 decades has been the true one, as opposed to the government's narrative, a lot of which was fabricated. The other thing I would like to see is proper, fair compensation for all those infected and affected. And I would like the government to start taking notice of the 2 hugely expensive reports which they've commissioned, one by Sir Robert Francis and one by Sir Brian Langstaff, chair of the inquiry, because in the last few days they've made several statements and they haven't mentioned those studies once.
And Kaz, regarding compensation, you were somebody who haven't received compensation. Some people have received interim payments. There's recommendations by the government that it should be paid, but you haven't received anything yet, have you? Are you worried that that will continue?
I am quite worried because when Sir Brian produced his second interim report a year ago, we all had very high hopes, and gradually over the past year, with the government working at pace, we've got more and more demoralised and more angry, and we're still having to campaign. So I'm quite concerned that the excluded groups, Hep B and the bereaved parents and children and people like me, post cut-off dates, won't be included. I'm concerned that the government won't deliver, they won't accept accountability and they won't deliver a fair.
And would accountability bring closure? Richard, do you think closure can come out of this?
I hope so. It's a concern as much as what Sue has said about the justice for all. It must be draw a line under this. We need justice for all. And it has that concern at the back of my mind that there is this accountability, and it needs to be established across the board. We don't want this 2-tier system where some of us who've been registered on the schemes have received some compensation already, not the final settlement, but it needs to be for everybody. Otherwise, it's sad, you know, and people who've suffered even more than I suffered, devastatingly. It needs to be across the board.
Let's go and speak to our political editor now, Martin Oates, to get the government's stance on this. Martin.
Well, the government told us it's consistently accepted the moral case for compensation, and that's why it's tabled an amendment to the Victims and Prisoners Bill, which enables the creation of a UK-wide infected blood compensation scheme and establishes a new arm's-length body to deliver it. Now, at face value, it sounds as if that's something the government's done of its own volition. That's not actually the case. So when this key bit of legislation was in the House of Commons just before Christmas, an amendment effectively to this effect, to set up this body and to set it up quickly, was tabled by the MP, Dame Diana Johnson, who leads the all-party parliamentary group on haemophilia and contaminated blood. Now, that gained a lot of support from opposition MPs and crucially from 22 Conservative MPs, including here in the southwest, Kevin Foster and Torbay and Anne-Marie Morris in Newton Abbot. Now, clearly, none of this can happen until the bill becomes law. It's in the House of Lords at the moment, but we need to wait for it to get royal assent to actually get onto the statute books. And just in terms of the final report we're expecting in a few weeks' time, the government says it will update Parliament on its next steps through an oral statement within 25 sitting days of the final report being published. Of course, ministers are held to those timetables very tightly.
OK, Martin, thank you very much for that. Sue, Richard, Kaz, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your stories with us. We will stay in touch. We hope to hear from you again after the public inquiry, and when those results have been published, I hope you'll come back to speak to us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there's much more information on this on the BBC News website and the app, of course.